Chapter 4 of The Eye of Osiris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Eye of Osiris by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 4. Legal Complications and a Jackal. My meditations brought me by a circuitous route, and 10 minutes late, to the end of Fetter Lane, where, exchanging my rather abstracted air for the alert manner of a busy practitioner, I strode briskly forward and darted into the surgery with knitted brows, as though just released from an anxious case. But there was only one patient waiting, and she saluted me as I entered with a snort of defiance. "Here you are, then," said she. "You are perfectly correct, Miss Oman," I replied. "In fact, you have put the case in a nutshell. What can I have the pleasure of doing for you?" "Nothing," was the answer. "My medical adviser is a lady, but I brought a note from Mr. Bellingham. Here it is." And she thrust the envelope into my hand. I glanced through the note and learned that my patient had had a couple of bad nights and a very harassing day. Could I have something to give me a night's rest? It concluded. I reflected for a few moments. One is not very ready to prescribe sleeping draughts for unknown patients, but still, insomnia is a very distressing condition. In the end I temporized with a moderate dose of bromide, deciding to call and see if more energetic measures were necessary. "He had better take a dose of this at once, Miss Oman," said I, as I handed her the bottle, "and I will look in later and see how he is." "I expect he will be glad to see you," she answered, "for he is all alone tonight and very dumpy. Miss Bellingham is out, but I must remind you that he is a poor man and pays his way. You must excuse my mentioning it." "I am very much obliged to you for the hint, Miss Oman," I rejoined. "It isn't necessary for me to see him, but I should like just to look in and have a chat." "Yes, that will do him good. You have your points, though punctuality doesn't seem to be one of them." And with this parting shot Miss Oman bustled away. 8:30 found me ascending the great dim staircase of the house in Neville's Court, preceded by Miss Oman, by whom I was ushered into the room. Mr. Bellingham, who had just finished some sort of meal, was sitting hunched up in his chair, gazing gloomily into the empty grate. He brightened up as I entered, but was evidently in very low spirits. "I didn't mean to drag you out after your day's work was finished," he said, "though I am very glad to see you." "You haven't dragged me out. I heard you were alone, so I just dropped in for a few minutes' gossip." "That is really kind of you," he said heartily, "but I'm afraid you'll find me rather poor company. A man who is full of his highly owned disagreeable affairs is not a desirable companion." "You mustn't let me disturb you if you'd rather be alone," said I, with a sudden fear that I was intruding. "Oh, you won't disturb me," he replied, adding with a laugh, "It's more likely to be the other way about. In fact, if I were not afraid of boring you to death, I would ask you to let me talk my difficulties over with you." "You won't bore me," I said. "It is generally interesting to share another man's experiences without their inconveniences. The proper study of mankind is man, you know, especially to a doctor." Mr. Bellingham chuckled grimly. "You make me feel like a microbe," he said. "However, if you would care to take a peep at me through your microscope, I will crawl under the stage for your inspection, though it is not my actions that furnish the materials for your psychological studies. It is my poor brother, who is the deus ex machina, who, from his unknown grave, as I fear, pulls the strings of this infernal puppet show." He paused, and for a space gazed thoughtfully into the grate as if he had forgotten my presence. At length he looked up and resumed. "It is a curious story, Doctor, a very curious story. Part of it you know, the middle part. I will tell you it from the beginning, and then you will know as much as I do, for as to the end, that is known to no one. It is written, no doubt, in the book of destiny, but the page has yet to be turned. The mischief began with my father's death. He was a country clergyman of very moderate means, a widower with 2 children, my brother John and me. He managed to send us both to Oxford, after which John went into the Foreign Office and I was to have gone into the Church. But I suddenly discovered that my views on religion had undergone a change that made this impossible, and just about this time my father came into a quite considerable property. Now, as it was his expressed intention to leave the estate equally divided between my brother and me, there was no need for me to take up any profession for a livelihood. Archaeology was already the passion of my life, and I determined to devote myself henceforth to my favorite study, in which, by the way, I was following a family tendency, for my father was an enthusiastic student of ancient Oriental history, and John was, as you know, an ardent Egyptologist. Then my father died quite suddenly and left no will. He had intended to have one drawn up, but had put it off until it was too late. And since nearly all the property was in the form of real estate, my brother inherited practically the whole of it. However, in deference to the known wishes of my father, he made me an allowance of $500 a year, which was about a quarter of the annual income. I urged him to assign me a lump sum, but he refused to do this. Instead, he instructed his solicitor to pay me an allowance in quarterly installments during the rest of his life, and it was understood that, on his death, the entire estate should devolve on me, or, if I died first, on my daughter Ruth. Then, as you know, he disappeared suddenly, and as the circumstances suggested that he was dead, and there was no evidence that he was alive, his solicitor, a Mr. Jellicoe, found himself unable to continue the payment of the allowance. On the other hand, as there was no positive evidence that my brother was dead, it was impossible to administer the will. You say the circumstances suggested that your brother was dead. What circumstances were they? Principally, the suddenness and completeness of the disappearance. His luggage, as you may remember, was found lying unclaimed at the railway station. And there was another circumstance even more suggestive. My brother drew a pension from the Foreign Office, for which he had to apply in person, or, if abroad, produce proof that he was alive on the date when the payment became due. Now, he was exceedingly regular in this respect. In fact, he had never been known to fail, either to appear in person or to transmit the necessary documents to his agent, Mr. Jellicoe. But from the moment when he vanished so mysteriously to the present day, nothing whatever has been heard of him. It's a very awkward position for you, I said, but I should think there would not be much difficulty in obtaining the permission of the court to presume death and to proceed to prove the will. Mr. Bellingham made a wry face. I expect you are right, he said, but that doesn't help me much. You see, Mr. Jellicoe, having waited a reasonable time for my brother to reappear, took a very unusual, but I think in the special circumstances, a very proper step. He summoned me and the other interested party to his office and communicated to us the provisions of the will, and very extraordinary provisions they turned out to be. I was thunderstruck when I heard them, and the exasperating thing is that I feel sure my poor brother imagined that he had made everything perfectly safe and simple. They generally do, I said rather vaguely. I suppose they do, said Mr. Bellingham, but poor John had made the most infernal hash of his will, and I am certain that he has utterly defeated his own intentions. You see, we are an old London family. The house in Queen Square, where my brother nominally lived, but actually kept his collection, has been occupied by us for generations, and most of the Bellinghams are buried in St. George's burial ground close by, though some members of the family are buried in other churchyards in the neighborhood. Now, my brother, who, by the way, was a bachelor, had a strong feeling for the family traditions, and he stipulated, not unnaturally, in his will, that he should be buried in St. George's burial ground among his ancestors, or, at least, in one of the places of burial appertaining to his native parish. But instead of simply expressing the wish and directing his executors to carry it out, he made it a condition affecting the operation of the will. Affecting it in what respect? I asked. In a very vital respect, answered Mr. Bellingham. The bulk of the property he bequeathed to me, or if I predeceased him, to my daughter Ruth. But the bequest was subject to the condition I have mentioned, that he should be buried in a certain place, and if that condition was not fulfilled, the bulk of the property was to go to my cousin, George Hurst. But in that case, said I, as you can't produce the body, neither of you could get the property. I am not so sure of that, he replied. If my brother is dead, it is pretty certain that he was not buried in St. George's or any of the other places mentioned, and the fact can easily be proved by production of the registers, so that a permission to presume death would result in the handing over to Hurst of almost the entire estate. Who is the executor? I asked. Ah, he exclaimed, there is another muddle. There are two executors. Jellicoe is one, and the other is the principal beneficiary, Hurst or myself, as the case may be. But, you see, neither of us can become an executor until the court has decided which of us is the principal beneficiary. But who is to apply to the court? I thought that was the business of the executors. Exactly. That is Hurst's difficulty. We were discussing it when you called the other day, and a very animated discussion it was, he added, with a grim smile. You see, Jellicoe naturally refuses to move in the matter alone. He says he must have the support of the other executor. But Hurst is not at present the other executor, neither am I. But the two of us together are the co-executor, since the duty devolves upon one or the other of us in any case. It's a complicated position, I said. It is, and the complication has elicited a very curious proposal from Hurst. He points out, Quite correctly, I am afraid.